Peace and welcome to you all. As Dan indicates, on behalf of the people, the vestry, the governing body, and the clergy, the people who welcome you, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Christ Church Cathedral, you may know, when it was built, prior to the Civil War, was one of two churches in downtown Nashville that stayed open through the war. At that point, it was a crossroads for people coming from all sorts of directions, many of faith, many from the splintered faiths within the Christian tradition. I think that has marked, in some ways, the people and mission of this community to insist and work to continue to be a crossroads for the people of Nashville and Tennessee. It seems to me the work people of Abraham is just exactly that kind of work, and we're pleased to have the building open to that end. I think further, it's also in the heart of the people here to see reconciliation as the central work. And so it seems to be this very much is part of it. Welcome, peace, enjoy the space, and I very much look forward to hearing from the speaker and the reflections afterwards from the books we share. I leave you with the blessing that you see prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. And may you live to see your children's children.
Thank you, Timothy. Before we go further, I thought I'd explain a little bit about how our evening is going to be structured. We're going to have our main speaker first. We'll talk for about 30 minutes. And then we'll have responses from two distinguished local figures who come up and join our main speaker up here at this conference table. So they'll have a conversation that you'll get to eavesdrop on for a few minutes. And at the same time, as you listen to the talk tonight, we have distributed cards that I think are on the pews for when you sat down, little index cards. You can use those to write questions that you might have for our speaker or for people providing reflections. Hand them to one of our ushers, and they'll be brought up, and we'll introduce those into the conversation. After we have our conversation and our questions, we'll retire to the parish hall for a reception, a light reception following our event. You can go through either of these doors and find your way there. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Daniel Tutt. He is a fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and a philosopher and social scientist who blogs. Of course, this is what one does now. Blogs about religion and philosophy at danieltutt.com. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Think Progress, and the Common Ground News Service. and he contributes regularly to the Huffington Post. He has a Master of Arts from the American University in Ethics, Peace, and Global Affairs, and he's doing doctoral work at the European Graduate School in Switzerland in the fields of continental philosophy, psychoanalysis, and media studies. In his work, Mr. Tutt promotes understanding and dialogue between people of all faiths. He serves as outreach director of Unity Productions Foundation, Berkeley Bede's Communications Initiatives. The title of his talk this evening is Breaking the Cycle, Faith Communities and the Transformation of Bigotry. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Dan.
Wonderful to be here tonight. I think I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, so I must have brought the rain with me. And like most of us, I'm on the tail end of a cold. So if I start to not make sense or if I pass out, just bring some water and maybe hopefully somebody knows CPR. And thank you for calling me a philosopher. I think a philosopher is like a poet. If one were to call himself a poet, they probably are not a poet. So I'm very grateful that you actually called me a philosopher, although I do not presume that title whatsoever. I'll just leave it at that. But I am very grateful to be here, and very grateful to Daoud in particular, and to the whole family of Abraham team. You guys are pretty inspiring, and I think your reputation is actually going beyond Nashville. And I'll get back to that in a moment. So I have a talk for you guys tonight that I've been working on for a few years. It's one of these talks that sort of evolves, and it has a life of its own. I'm sure many of you are familiar with those kinds of presentations. And so in thinking of your community, of who you are, and what little I know about the great work that you guys do as people of different faiths, trying to make a difference, trying to work towards justice, I thought that I would start by understanding, breaking down, what we mean by bigotry. I chose bigotry because I think it's the best word. Now, in general discourse, in general parlance, words and terms get thrown out there, and we have to just accept them. Recently, Islamophobia was actually, by the Associated Press, removed. By the Associated Press and the Wall Street Journal, they no longer use that term, which for activists in the Muslim space, this is a very strange thing, because for the last 10 years, or maybe more, we've been dealing with it in one form or another. It is a real thing, despite what many people say. But to remove it is problematic. But ultimately, I would argue that it's not our role to define the word. So the word is really arbitrary. But I'd like to suggest on a deeper level that when we say prejudice, bigotry, Islamophobia, racism, we talk about violence. This is a type of violence. Now, bear with me while I break down what I mean by violence. I identify three types of violence. The first is what I call subjective violence. This is violence we see on the news. This is physical violence that takes place. Subjective violence is so named because it's waged by human beings, and it leaves us to ask questions about the nature of violence itself. Oftentimes we wonder, can we actually create a society whereby violence might be completely extinguished? Is it caused by systems? Is it caused by human nature? There's a myriad of different questions on that. The second type of violence is what I call symbolic violence. This is a much more abstract sort of violence. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, argued that in the core of our language, we're thrown into violence. That at a very primal level. Now, we'll return to that in a moment, but for bigotry, it's the third type, and this is what I call objective violence. So this is a type of violence that is waged in the I-other relation. It's waged by excluding the other, forming stereotypes of the other, and basing a judgment on the other that based on their culture, or their religion, or their race, they are an exception to standards that we would apply to someone else. I call this objective because we're making an object out of our fear. If in symbolic violence, all we have is general fear, objective violence has an end. It has a human being, it has a culture, it has a religion, it has a face, and a face is very significant. Now, in order to understand prejudice, bigotry, and stereotypes, or what I'm calling objective violence, we need to take a step back from physical violence. Even though physical violence, the images that evoke in our minds, they're intimately connected. Now, the Dr. Martin Luther King claimed that objective violence was a form of spiritual violence. And his ethics on how to deal with spiritual violence was one that was very, very deeply rooted within the Christian tradition, as we all know. It's one that rests upon an ethical conundrum. Ultimately, Dr. King saw violence as a repetition. It repeated itself over and over. But he had a hopeful vision. He believed that through practical work on the ground, people can create what he called the beloved community. And the beloved community was a community that embraced all God's children, but did not see in their racial or religious diversity merely a good in itself, but, and this is the key, the beloved community was the realization of universal justice. So Dr. King's legacy is significant for us because when we gather as the Abrahamic family, that is not a good in and of itself. That's just a beginning point. That's how I read Dr. King. Dr. King's vision was that justice cannot be deferred, but must be realized now. His optimistic Christian ethics was based on the view that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. In this incredible statement, King sought to connect his Christian idea of justice that has an end, a sense of justice that is directional, to his practical vision of social justice. Now, today we hear a lot of this term social justice. And frankly, it's a term that's become controversial, it's become politicized. So if you'd allow me to refer to the more basic term justice, because I think in using and invoking the term justice, this is a term that all the religions can identify with. Indeed, our faith traditions, we often forget, they are also moral and ethical traditions that are so rich with this idea of justice that I would argue in our secular society, many people may try to claim that God is dead, but they have to understand that the origin of how our secular society conceives of justice comes from the Abrahamic religions. We still see justice through the eyes of the Abrahamic faiths. Now, restoring and promoting justice and just solutions is also at the center of ending the cycle of violence. Often, bigotry towards the other is often merely an outcome of a lack of justice in a particular society. There were many points at which Dr. King could have compromised. He could have given up after he achieved the Civil Rights Act with a partial equality. But he didn't do that. You'll remember in this picture where he is in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was assassinated, he was actually standing up for the rights of sanitation workers. So in this very particular small point of justice, he was actually still working towards the beloved community. He did not see the work of justice as being done. Now, the key thing I want to point out here is that some people argue, ethicists and human rights and civil rights thinkers, that we live in a world today where the question of justice is no longer the leading question. Now, I want to make a book recommendation. Robert Meister's After Evil goes into this. Now, he makes the argument in this book that the 20th century saw violence as a cycle that can be ended through remembering what violence was. Now, the ultimate memorial to violence was the Holocaust. Today, our ethics on justice, according to Meister, still remain limited because they are still based on the framework that a past evil cannot be ended unless it is forgotten. Thus, to end violence, we must always remember the past and prevent past traumas from taking place. But this is the limit, he claims, to our idea of justice. It's still based on a prism of remembrance and trying to prevent a violence that occurred in the past. This way of justice through remembrance of past violence is built around keeping evil at bay, but it comes at a cost. And the cost is one that Dr. King refused to compromise on. And that is the cost of postponing justice. But the evil of the past cannot be reconciled in the present until we make justice in the present an imperative. So my question for you tonight is, how can we, communities of diverse faiths, make justice an imperative? Is this indeed something we wish to do? Does this have anything to do with bigotry? I claim that it does. So I'd like to start by looking at the ethics of the Abrahamic tradition, albeit very briefly. Of course, each tradition has a very diverse ethical tradition, but I would claim there are 4 commonalities in Judaism, in Islam, and Christianity when it comes to this question of ending cycles of violence. At the core of Islam, we find that Muslims are mandated by God to protect people of other faiths, especially people of the book. In the Quran, God says, "Do you love your Creator? Serve your fellow man first." In Surah 49, God says, "We made you into many tribes and many people so that you would come to know each other, not despise one another." The Prophet Muhammad had created an alliance with pre-Islamic tribes called the Alliance of the Virtuous, and actually maintained loyalty to that even to the very end, when it was at its most tenuous points. And these are with non-Muslims. And he insisted his followers to follow through with the treaties and the rights that were accorded to these people that refused to adopt his religion. In Christianity, Christ mentions love of one's neighbor twice. And of course we know St. Paul was the one who would radicalize this love of the other. In one epistle alone, Paul would invoke love of one's neighbor at least 10 times. Now, in Judaism, I would argue that things go even further, because it's no longer the neighbor, it's the stranger. In the Torah, 36 times love the stranger is mentioned, 36 times. That's incredible to me. Now, this is, according to our ethical tradition, a demand. It is a demand by God put onto us to stand with, to protect the other. I want to invoke the ethical philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, wonderful Jewish 20th century thinker, who argued that ethics is so important to understand that it comes before ontology, it comes before politics, it comes before culture. It is the number one thing that we as people must face. Now, Levinas taught us that the face, what he called the face of the other, not a physical face, but a spectral, imaginary face, is what is at the core of the demand that we find in the Abrahamic traditions. While, of course, there are also much in the Abrahamic traditions where this is hotly contested. Paul warns his followers that the devil can be found in non-Christians. Islam sees the tribes before Muhammad as in a state of jahiliyyah, or ignorance. And Jews, as the chosen people, certainly have a propensity for exclusivity. So exclusivity is there. But I would argue that our religious traditions are so vast and so diverse and so embodied and so lived that it's up to us. It's up to us to interpret it. It's up to us to interpret it. But if we follow Levinas's philosophy and his encounter with the other, we find a demand that comes prior to our being in the world. Before religion and before our identities form, Levinas claims we have a commitment to the other. He says the other keeps me as a hostage. The face of the other, in my encounter with it, I experienced an inescapable demand. If we follow his consequences of this inescapable demand, what we find is that he argues that to understand the other starts with trauma, that there is something traumatic at a core level. Not even, I'm not talking about, I'm an Episcopalian and I go to a mosque. I'm talking about others in most abstract sense possible, which means that it makes it even more challenging. His philosophy challenges us even more to understand those outside of our comfort zone. The other's arrest of me, his holding me in hostage, is the source of what Levinas calls the holy other. And this is actually the source of transcendence. So in other words, Levinas argues that we get to know God through our exchange with the other. But this encounter with the other, because it is so originary to our experience, it's also embedded prior to language. Like I said, violence is a source of language. Ultimately, I'll stop going into his work. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of his work. His ethics helps us understand our global situation today. Why do I say this? I say this because we live in a new world. I know everybody always says, when we first came here, we were coming to a new world. We're always going into a new world. But when it comes to ethics, I claim that we are going into a new world. The toppling of a dictator in Egypt can make all of us feel a sense of universal justice, even though we've probably never been to Egypt. I've never been to Egypt. I don't know about you. Does anyone know who this face is up here? Who was he? Yes, that's correct. We should remember that this face was the cause of the dominoes that spilled. What did he do? He was just like many young people. He went to college, got his degree, and couldn't find a job. He was excluded. He was working for his parents' convenience store in a shop. And he felt hopeless. He felt depressed. He was the embodiment of a whole generation of Egyptians that had suffered from economic injustice. So he set himself ablaze and he committed a symbolic suicidal act. But this face went onto the internet and millions of people around the world shared his face, and he became larger than life. He became a symbol that transcended all otherness. As an American living in Nashville, you could see something in his face that transcended even the minor differences of him being a Muslim or him being an Egyptian. The same can be said of this image. This image here fundamentally changed Americans' perceptions of the Vietnam War. This was when monks in Vietnam had lost hopelessness to such a degree that they set themselves ablaze. I don't know if you guys knew this, but when this image hit Life magazine, it changed public opinion about the war in Vietnam. It brought it home. It made it a human connection. So ultimately, Levinas helps us think through this new situation. Because what he shows is that we are compelled to act by the suffering of others. We're compelled to act by the suffering of others. And the proximity of another's suffering is no longer as relevant today. It's no longer as relevant. As such, we don't merely receive information from the media passively, but we're constantly affronted by something beyond our will. And this presents us with the ethical demand. So I claim that every morning we wake up, we're presented with being held hostage to some calamity. Maybe it's Sandy Hook. When Sandy Hook took place, I'm a father, I was devastated. Absolutely devastated, as I'm sure many of you are. This is the power of the image. Do you think that people would feel that feeling of devastation prior to the global relay of media? I don't think so. I don't think so. So ethical demands stem from the image. They are unique, precisely because they do not require our consent, nor are they rooted in any social contracts. I don't have to feel bad about the way that this happens in Egypt just because, or I don't have to ignore it. It comes without my choice. It may influence you completely without my choice. It shows that we have a certain primal level of global connectivity, in the sense that we're always ready, but at the same time we're always unprepared for what the image can do to us. What happens when this image takes place in our backyard? What happens when it happens to a mosque, to a synagogue? No longer is it entirely possible to claim that what is happening so far from me does not somehow make me responsible for it. Yet it often seems that we have to be overwhelmed to act. We often have to have the image framed in a certain way. It has to be presented to us in a way that will try to create a certain effect. Ultimately, the real question that Levinas's philosophy leaves us with is, to what extent do I remain true to the original arrest that the other has of me? If, as he claims, I am so radically committed to the other, and his commitment transcends my allegiance to my own group, to my own tribe, to my own religion, to my own family, why then is it so difficult for the religions to get along with one another? Perhaps it is the fact that our original trauma is so real, that this original commitment, this holding hostage, does exist. Maybe that's the reason why. Most of the Abrahamic religions don't practice this type of ethics that we're talking about tonight. But it is at the core of their teachings. I shouldn't say they don't practice it. I guess amongst the religions, when they come together, we don't see it as often they manifest. I would claim that we stray away from our commitments that we have together, and often we fall into a self-centered approach. And I want to talk a little bit about this. This is what I call the tolerance model of engaging the other. Often we express compassion for the other, when in reality what we're doing is substituting the suffering that the other is experiencing for our own idea of suffering. Both tolerance and, to a lesser extent, compassion are often asserted, I would claim, to deny uglier feelings within our own selves. We project ourselves onto the image of the other, and the other who is facing the bigotry, who's facing the discrimination, whose rights are being threatened, can all of a sudden become an imaginary victim that does not exist, or one that we feel bad for and that we don't act upon. Because I claim that at the core, when we do this, there's a type of catharsis. It gratifies us in some way. The French sociologist René Girard says that the victim is always the one to blame for collective catastrophes. And he claims that at the core of the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have a universalization of the victim. So what this means is that if Girard is right, if that at the core of our Christian and Jewish and Muslim ethics, we like the victim. We rely on the victim. This makes our own internal ethics a bit more problematic, and a bit more work needs to be done internally. When we make the other a victim, what we do is we reduce the other's agency. And suddenly, we become in the position of control, often without being aware of it. For many of us, particularly in America, we've grown accustomed to this. What this does is it gives one party agency, but at the cost of having a great amount of guilt. We must be the savior of the other. We must protect the other. Ultimately, this comes at the price of not really getting to know the other. Or it comes at the price of only responding to the other's demand when they're facing a crisis. Now, don't get me wrong. This concern for suffering, and in our case, bigotry done to others, to our brothers and sisters of other faiths, is crucial. If we didn't have this innate compassion, which I claim that we have, we wouldn't be here tonight. We wouldn't be here tonight. But I would also claim that to improve the way that we exert tolerance, the way that we exert compassion, it's doubly difficult when we have such diversity. We can't agree on many things within our own traditions. And then imagine the difficulty of that once it's brought to this level. If Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, how could that ethic ever be put into practice with a group? You would have to switch from an interfaith group that focuses on feeding the hungry and responding to injustice to a philosophy club. You would not get anything done. So I'm going to make a pivot from this philosophy to something more practical. And hopefully some of you are sighing a breath of relief. But not my friend who introduced me as a philosopher. He will forever be in the closest part of my heart. What I'd like to suggest is that ultimately, first of all, I've been asked to make some recommendations about how the work we're doing can improve. Ultimately, what I'd like to see is that the model of tolerance, the model of compassion that we are dealing with today is one that sacrifices what I call authenticity. We often find ourselves, and for this, I lied actually, I do have a little bit more philosophy, if you'll bear with me. Just a little bit more. And then we'll get to more practical stuff. For this, I want to turn to another tradition. And this is what the tradition that comes out of Freud's work, psychoanalysis. Now, I know that Freud is usually a bad word. He has a very bad reputation for good reasons. But his ethics is one that I claim is very powerful. And why do I say that? In the school of psychoanalysis, they actually argue that real authentic understanding of the other is almost at a point of impossibility. But that it is at that point that you have to remain true to. You have to have some fidelity to that point of not being able to fully understand the other. That's the basic ethical condition. So, this school of thought gives us a strong ethical vision. It claims that any true encounter with the other is traumatic precisely because if it is truly authentic, I am not able to put myself into a self-centered position with the other, even though that might be what I desire. There is always a gap separating me from the other when I discover the other in their real state or in their real condition. This encounter with the other is not necessarily discovered, and this is crucial, through learning about the other's faith, through learning about their scripture. In fact, it's actually encountered in a way that's usually more circumstantial. That usually does happen through crisis, or that does happen through becoming a friend on Facebook, or going to coffee with someone. It happens much more randomly. It doesn't happen in a formal way. The demand I'm talking about, the demand. This demand presents us with a point where we can actually move beyond this model of guilt-ridden, self-centered tolerance into a new vision, one that's more authentic. So if we want to find a more authentic type of compassion for the other, we must ultimately have a greater sense of respect for the reality of others' suffering, for the fact that their foreignness is something that will always be there, and that we should not try to co-opt it or bring it into our own universe. We also have to recognize that the other's suffering and the other's foreign experiences is something that we will not be able to master. I will not be able to fully ever understand everything about you, but that's not the point. That's not the point. And I often think we do impose a sense of guilt, because I've been through probably hundreds of interfaith dialogues by now. Even though I'm fairly young, I do this for a living. And I can tell you that often I leave either with a great feeling of let down, like I didn't really get deep enough, or I leave with a great sense of catharsis. And I tell you, it is, and you all know this idea of catharsis, like this idea of a release, of that feeling. You go home, you go to bed, and you really feel like you shed something. You shed a skin. You've actually expressed yourself in a way where you feel like maybe you've learned something about yourself. That's the kind of engagement with the other that does not need a crisis. That's the kind of engagement with the other that I want to talk about tonight. Now, one way to do that is to form coalitions, to form partnerships. Coalitions are essential for interfaith groups to form when combating bigotry because they're able to form concrete demands. Now, in some cases, one is reminded of what Nelson Mandela did to tear down apartheid in South Africa. We're reminded, of course, of Gandhi's salt marches. But today we face new realities. Remember, Dr. King was assassinated standing up for sanitation workers. This was a small issue in the grand scheme of things. He was not doing some major heroic activity. I think it's very important to humanize and to localize our struggles, but always keep them through the prism of justice. Now, coalitions for interfaith groups are very fascinating. They're fascinating because they require consensus, which means that ultimately what we choose to deal with represents something that could possibly be very, very universal in terms of its injustice. And what I've noticed for interfaith groups has been a great movement to things such as climate change, to things such as poverty, to things such as sometimes war and violence, things that when you have such a diversity of political spectrums, of religious ideologies, all coming together and agreeing that this is something that we need to tackle together, that means that that cause has something righteous about it. Now, the downside is that there are, of course, problems. Coalitions face problems. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a great example. Some of the organizers have asked me to touch upon ways in which we can possibly examine the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a way that is fruitful. Critics on the Palestinian side have pointed out that to engage in such a dialogue, what they call a dialogue industry, which is formed, goes to normalize what they see, this is what they see as an occupation. So they see these dialogue efforts actually as contributing to something that further entrenches the oppression at play. That's their view. The Israeli view is largely open to it, I would claim. There's generally a greater level of receptivity, although of course there are some pockets where you're not going to have openness to it. But for the most part, there is a great consensus in American interfaith coalitions that dialogue on the topic is important, despite the fact that much of this dialogue is very difficult to get off the ground. Often, it speaks to the choir, when it shouldn't, right? It mistakes speaking to the choir activities as promoting something transformative. But if anything, it really just goes to reinforce already existing perspectives. So the best way to start looking at this issue, in my opinion, is to start with the actual groups that are on the ground doing peacemaking and dialogue work in Palestine and in Israel. Now the good news is there's thousands of these groups, literally. People don't know how many people wake up every single day committed to a peaceful and just solution. You would be surprised how many organizations have board members that are evenly divided between Israelis and Palestinians that have to make financial decisions. One such group that I wanted to recommend, perhaps you could have them in Nashville, the prerequisite to become a member is that you have to have a family member who's died in the conflict. They're called the Bereaved Parents Family Circle. Maybe some of you guys have heard of them. Talk about transformative people. I met somebody who lost both of his brothers, and he was sitting in a panel with someone who also lost people. Incredible group. Another group is Just Vision. In fact, I have them here, if anyone would like to. We'll come back to these slides in a moment. Just Vision, and these are just three of my favorites. Just Vision has made 3 or 4 films that seek to portray what's going on in the realm of nonviolent movements to overcome some of the conflict stuff, and it's great. They do film screenings and discussions in small groups. And then another thing, of course, is to actually go there. Daoud actually is from Jerusalem, and he could be a great resource on that. But another one would be a group called Masjid Tours, which is ran by some of my friends in Washington, D.C. Now, my second recommendation to you is that you need to develop a theory of change. If we really are committed to justice, to promoting justice, not social justice, not the kind of stuff that people like Glenn Beck hate, but justice, what our faith traditions tell us is justice, then you need to develop a theory of change. Now, what do I mean by that? In my work at Unity Productions Foundation, we're interested in seeing how our program of film and dialogue can actually be a catalyst for changing national opinion. In other words, we want to measure if you're coming here tonight, not to this specific event, but to one that would screen our film and put you in conversation with the other, with a Muslim in this case, and then the way that you might, after months, years after that, change the larger society around you. Maybe you read a book about the topic. Maybe you speak with a family member and clarify something during Thanksgiving dinner. Because when it comes to anti-Muslim sentiment, we all have an Uncle Mike. And the Uncle Mike is the guy who just doesn't get it, right? Now, I don't mean to be condescending towards Uncle Mike, because I literally have an Uncle Mike who does not get what I do. And he probably won't, but that's okay, right? But at least we can give him information and we can continue to try. Now, developing a theory of change also involves developing a theory of the cause of bigotry. What is the cause of what's going on? Now, I'd like to suggest that there are 2 ways that we can understand the cause of bigotry. Now, to preface this, we should remember that if you look at the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., never is the word tolerance mentioned once. Not once. Imagine if Martin Luther King said, I want to have full equal rights so that people will tolerate us. It sounds silly. It sounds silly, but is this the discourse that our post-9/11 world has brought us to? I sure hope not. So in one approach, the cause of bigotry primarily has to do with a general fear of otherness. Right? So the basic argument is that Muslims in this case, let's say, or maybe are just like the Catholics before them, just like the Japanese before them, and just like the African Americans before them. Not to say that those bigotries or those groups are no longer existent, they're still here. So they claim that to combat this kind of bigotry, what we need to do is build personal relationships. We need to promote education about the other. Right? Sounds good. They don't necessarily see the cause as one of power, or one that the government does, or one that war does, or anything like that. They think it's more, I guess you could say, part of human nature. And maybe as I'm saying this, you would put yourself into one of these categories. Now, I call this the bridging model. Now, the Harvard sociologist Robert Tutt wrote a book called American Grace, where he pontificated the bridging model very well. What he did was he studied how interfaith coalitions around the country can build better understanding and break down misunderstanding amongst themselves. A New York Times columnist wrote about his book, and what he did was he compared Islamophobia to homophobia. And he said, the best way to understand Islamophobia is not to look at the civil rights movement as an example, but it's actually to look at homophobia. And he claims that it's because ultimately the problem comes down to the fact that just not enough Americans know a Muslim personally, right? 63% of Americans, according to USA Today, claim they've never met a Muslim. So therefore, once the community grows, they will become more assimilated or integrated into the larger American society, and all this stuff will subside. So there's some truth to this. There's some truth to this. But the other side, the other model of understanding the cause of bigotry is what I call the critical model. Now, this is a total model, I would say. It's a model that says bigotry is a nasty outgrowth of, it's a limb of a larger tree of injustice that goes on in the world. They claim that to combat bigotry, we must be more holistic. We must actually wage a critique in a wider sense. Now, where I think both of these models find some common ground, and I could go into more of that, but I won't, because I think ultimately the core of what our work here is not political. And I don't want to politicize anything, because I think that actually, especially when it comes to prejudice of a religious group, precisely because all of our congregants here are of such diverse political backgrounds, it's useless. But that's not to deny the fact that political maneuvering in power certainly causes a lot of things. But where I think the critical model and the bridging model coalesce is through the figure of Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams was a founding father, and he's the architect of American religious liberty. Now, Roger Williams, we all talk about American exceptionalism, and we are an exceptional country. But remember, our founding fathers believed that part of the reason why we're exceptional was precisely because of our religious freedom. That value was something that should be celebrated. Should be celebrated, which is why any historian will look at what's been going on after 9/11 and the rise of religious prejudice, and they will say that is a very un-American thing. Roger Williams had a vision that sought to protect the free conscience of people to express religion to the farthest extent possible. I would call his vision radical. I would call it radical pluralism, where there is absolutely no fear of the other. Only fear of the other is the extent to which the state can intervene in the private life of the other and interfere with their expression of their religion. What he said that the prerequisite for citizenship in the United States democracy was the cultivation of a healthy imagination for difference. Now, part of the reason why I claim that politics doesn't need to enter into the equation is because I want to ask you guys what you think the answer is to this question. The strongest predictor among Americans who harbor prejudice towards Muslims is being a Republican, having prejudice towards Jews, being an evangelical, frequent religious students, being an engaging city. I think the good news is that the answer is B. The answer is B, which means that ultimately, when we're talking about this issue of bigotry, we are talking about something that is a part of our culture, that has always existed, and that's a fear of foreignness, a fear of the other. Now the good news is if I could connect the latter part of my talk to the beginning part, is that in our traditions we have the equipment, we have the ethical equipment to overcome this. Because ultimately, Muslims may be the new bad guys, but tomorrow it could be anyone. At the end of the day, I think we are equal opportunity bigots. Obviously, not us, but it does exist. So, in conclusion, I wanted to thank you for having me, and really hope that we can open this up to a community-type dialogue and forum, and hopefully some of this was useful, because my ultimate point was that the terms that come to define the way we relate to the other, being compassionate, being tolerant, I think we need to always be extraordinarily critical and self-reflective in the same way that we would in our private lives. We should to ourselves, which makes us the best people possible. We should also manifest that in this diverse coalition that we have right now. Because when I look out here, I see great diversity. But it would be a shame if that diversity stopped there and we celebrated the diversity as a good in itself. Again, I claim this diversity is just a starting point to tackle things much larger than ourselves. So thank you very much.
If you'd like to turn in a card, go ahead and bring it up, and they'll be walking around and hand those in. And then they'll feed the questions up to me. So after they have a few minutes to talk, I'll start giving them. Whoever would like to start?
First of all, peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum, shalom, and whatever else. I've had a long day. I just got a quarter 5 minutes before I was supposed to be here. I didn't have a chance to get home, but we made it. I enjoyed the conversation. As a matter of fact, I'm in our community, the Muslim community, and I am a member of the community of Imam Muhammad, many may know it. And he has always been a proponent of interfaith dialogue. Starting back as early as 1975, there was a relationship built with Catholics, and he eventually got us audience with the Pope, Pope John Paul II. This dialogue, as a matter of fact, 9/11, because of here in Nashville, we had a dialogue called the Genesis study. Some of you may have been a member of that. And because of that Genesis study that we had, when the actual 9/11 happened here in Nashville, we were so, I think about 18 of some of the largest churches in Nashville participated in that Genesis study. And we got to know each other to such an extent that when this happened, I think it saved a disaster in this city. And there was very little harm that came to Muslims because of 9/11. Because the people who knew us on the Genesis study, they were in these congregations, and they were able to make sure that those who didn't know and needed to know got the opportunity to meet with Muslims or have Muslims come to their churches and organizations to talk to them about Islam. One other thing in conclusion, as Muslims, we have to make sure that we tell our story. We can't let Glenn Begg and Rush Limbaugh tell our story. We have to make sure that we tell our story. And so, consequently, we have to purchase and make sure that we have airtime on radio
and then I was tired of reading, so I do want to say, I feel very inadequate in trying to represent Christians. Such a broad spectrum. So, I will speak from my own standpoint, but I appreciate the efforts you're doing, and I appreciate the family of Abraham and what you're doing for and with the community of Nashville. I'm new here, a couple of years into it, came to help grow this Institute of Christian Spirituality, and our goal of the Institute is to help people draw closer to God and become those instruments of love that Mr. Tutt here was talking about. That it's about how we illuminate the world around us. It's, what's the use of claiming a faith if it's not making a difference in our context? So I really applaud the efforts that you're doing. I think it speaks to certainly my faith as truly trying to live out that love, which transcends many boundaries and many ethnic groups and faiths. And so often the Christian community, out of fear, and this may or may not speak to other groups, has excluded ourselves from conversations, feeling that we're condoning things, I guess. But as opposed to recognizing similarities and the ways we can work together in this hurting world, there's way too much to do to be sectioned off and not being collaborating in what we can do. So I love what I've read here, and I appreciate being part of this conversation.
We're starting to get questions from the audience, so I'll go ahead and start feed these to you folks, and whoever would like to answer. How can we change the discussion or dialogue when fear is persistent and dwells in the average American, and then in parentheses, who bases opinions on our media?
I'm not qualified to answer that. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes? Well, good, okay. I think, again, that Dr. King would be our exemplar. I know it's maybe tiresome to always hear about Dr. King, but I think it's for a reason. Because, each year we celebrate this man's legacy, and he was someone who was, if violence was a repetition, the way to cure it was to also exert the opposite force of repetition. And that's what he did over and over and over and over. So, one of the things I was talking with a gentleman from the media before, and he said that the family of Abraham began at the same time that another group began, and that the other group is no longer doing anything. And that perhaps one of the reasons why the other group is no longer doing anything is because there's nothing in the media. There's nothing, thank God, there's nothing going on. But the family of Abraham has gotten to a deeper level. I was having lunch with members of the group today, and they were joking as if they were literally family members talking about how they would introduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at an event. One being Muslim, he would introduce the Israeli side, and one Jew would introduce the Palestinian side. That's the level of trust that they've developed together. So that's through the repetition of meeting, and that can be boring, that can be enlightening, it can be cathartic, it can be many things, but you have to do it. You have to show up. Coming to events like this is one way to do something. It's definitely something more than sharing something you like on Facebook or something like that, but I think there's something there. I think in terms of the image of Islam and the media and the stereotypes, it's something that baffles me as well. I don't have a clear answer, but I would simply say that getting the stories out there is essential. And frankly, we should never forget that about 20% or lower, something I historians have a debate on this, of the slaves that were forced to come here were Muslim. Remember Kunta Kinte and Roots in the 70s, where he would say Allah and they would be praying. And that actually happened in a Hollywood film in the 70s, but nobody cared because the Muslims weren't really the bad guys at that time. So we also need to understand that this is ephemeral, it's changing, and I think we just need to stick with it and continue to do this work.
Here's another question. What does radical pluralism look like in some specific practical examples, and can it become as institutionalized as our separate faith institutions without supplanting them?
I think in Memphis, Tennessee, we saw an example of this with Heart Song Church. Does everyone know about what happened there? Well, the Heart Song Church, the Imam knows. What they did was pretty miraculous. They allowed the Muslims their mosque was trying to be built, they were facing some backlash. And by the way, basically every Muslim community that tries to build a mosque in most parts of the United States faces some kind of backlash. It's just the unfortunate reality. But they were facing it, and this church opened up their doors and allowed them to pray during the month of Ramadan and break their fast every single night for 2 years in a row. And the Imam was not I guess you could say a liberal Imam. And that it was a pastor. And you know what I'm talking about, And so it was a miraculous thing that they had that commitment that was purely theological. That's radical pluralism. Purely working off of the dictates of their faith. That's the pure justification of why they're doing what they're doing. That's what I think is quite amazing. And it's also something that I think is very distinctly American. I was recently in Canada. I did an event similar to tonight's event, but it was just on Islamophobia. And the Muslims there, many of them were ashamed to express their Islamic identity because they live in such a secular society. So the fact that we have such room still, despite this stuff that's going on against Muslims and so on, we should never forget that we are still a place, a beacon on the hill that does allow that expression of religion. It still is there.
Here's one. I had a friend who didn't like Jews, but she liked me. So she said I wasn't like all the others. Why do they do that? Anyone have an answer?
When you meet your personal friend, everybody like their friend. And then I think our minds are formed in our communities, in our families, and sometimes those minds, they have the bigotry in it. So we hold on to our bigotry, but we like our friend. And our friend is part of the thing that we, back in the early days after the Civil Rights Movement, some people had friends that were black, but they had no concern for all African American people. They just had this one or two friends that were black. So this is something that happens, and so I think that we form from our group. If our group have bigotry, we have that bigotry, and then we meet our friend we can personally interact with. If we had that same personal interaction with a whole lot of other people who were Jews, we would probably feel the same way with a lot of them. So, and I think in addressing the question earlier about how can we make this work, the prophet used to say something. He said, "Let those who are present tell those who are absent." And that's what we have to do. Those who are here and hear these things and hear what the family of Abraham and people work hard at bringing this diversity together. Once we see that, we should also be witnesses, and every chance we should make it known to the public.
Let me add something, since you got to go back, I'm going to go back to the person. I think it takes courage. There's specifically addressing the fear. those personal relationships are what does it. When I meet someone and I'm willing to step beyond my culture's boundaries and start a relationship, then that's going to show others that this is acceptable. We can do this, and it moves us beyond the fear.
I want to say one thing. You know, part of the argument that people make is that we have real criticism of what is going on in the world in the name of Islam. We have real anxiety, we have real fears about that. And so what they say is that the work of maybe a group like Family of Abraham seeks to cover over that, or seeks to ignore that, right? And I would claim that we need to be very vigilant on that issue. And on the contrary, we need to be the ones that are putting that front and center. We should never forget that Muslims themselves have equal amounts of fear about what goes on in the name of Islam. Never forget that. They're ashamed of it too. Absolutely. They have real struggles with that. They have real anger with that. You know? So it's a very complex thing that requires a highly sensitive terrain to cover. And so I think the fact that many of you maybe are part of a congregation where your fellow congregants may criticize you for participating in an event like this. I think that maybe one way to pivot their perspective would be to actually say, well, you know, the truth is I actually got to break bread with them, but I learned something about their own fear, and I learned something that utterly shocked me about the other. And those things happen all the time in interfaith dialogue. They happen all the time. And if they don't happen, then maybe you're not going to need to get dialogue.
Questions are coming in faster than I can ask them, so bear with me if I don't get to your question, but I'll try. There are two that are kind of similar. I'm going to, if you'll agree, I'll try to read them both and then see. I think they're similar. First of all, it was mentioned that it is important for events that are like this in nature not to serve as a good within a good, essentially good for the sake of itself. But I think, just to go beyond just having the dialogue and being together, but to go beyond what you're saying. However, this event is in its nature because people who are here today are those who have learned about these subjects by themselves. So, what are some asset-based, tangible ways of scaling out the effort effectively in nature, and moving towards another kind of result? And the observation, most of the people here are mostly of like mind, given that how can the bigots be reached through meaningful interfaith dialogue?
I'll start with that one. I think again it starts at an individual level. As you were talking about speaking to the choir, that almost reinforces the dialogue at times. And that is a daydream. We all gather together like minds, and this would be the same situation. But at an individual level, going back to my context, which is not a like mind, and being willing to continue that dialogue further. I'm talking about this gathering, this meeting, this speaker I heard, this is what I was talking about at the end, and just starting those conversations, and again, just having the courage to bring it up in a setting that is not open to it.
I agree with this courage matter because, sometimes some people know things, but they're afraid to say it, A lot of times, even in our business, they say people represent it, and Muslims know this is not your business, but they don't want to say it. So we have to say it. We have to say it. There's a verse in our Quran it said, and I just recited that verse, it said, Maliki Yawmiddin. And it's translated, Master of the Day of Judgment. But actually, it don't like say that. the way it's translated. It says, Maliki means master, Yomli, day, deen, religion. And Imam taught us that this verse is saying that God is the author of owner of the day that's coming, when the religious communities all work together for the advancement and the good of all human beings. When the religious community, the day of religion, not just our religion, but the day of all religion, when they work together, this day is coming, when we will be working together for the good and advancement of all people together. And so this is what we have to do. And when the time comes, we have to have the courage to do that. You know, our prophet wasn't a man of fear. Jesus wasn't a man of fear. Moses wasn't a man of fear. So once we know, then we're responsible.
This is a question that I think is really directed towards the family of Abraham. And so y'all are out there, listen up. Families do more than talk. Are there activities this family can or will engage in? Talking is talking is a necessary first step, but not merely enough. I think that goes along with what Mr. Tutt was saying. I'm just wondering if you could give us one suggestion of what the family of Abraham could do beyond organizing events of this nature.
Well, I think that a couple of things. One would be, talking, coming together in diversity can be kind of a paralyzing thing because everyone has such great emotions about the act itself of coming together. But that can also be a thing that holds you back from achieving something, from going a little bit further. And I would say setting up programs, making sure that you have representation at events that happen outside of your own circle, that you send people to when a natural disaster takes place, when a crisis takes place, you send representatives of the family of Abraham so that this whole community can see that your values are represented on this stage. That might be one way that you can actually manifest what you're doing. Because another thing is, to reach beyond the choir requires that you become a symbol, right? The word is needs to become symbolized in the community. People need to know about it. So you also need to really promote it. I did notice you guys got a Facebook page a couple days ago. That's a great first start. Because like it or not, Facebook is a pretty big deal. It's the thing. So that's important too. But I would say another major thing is service. And when you serve those in need, it can be a huge level of catharsis. I don't know if you guys have done that before, but that's a wonderful thing to do. There's many programs that offer study guides for reflection that combine service and then dialogue, and those can be wonderful programs to do. For example, I just participated in a thing called the Weekend of Twinning, which is the largest global coming together on one weekend of mosques and synagogues around the world. And they do feeding the hungry all day, and then in the evening they debrief and they do a whole deep discussion. And sometimes they bring professional facilitators to come in. And I would also say, try to promote dialogue and not just public speakers. Public speakers, become more participatory. Offer opportunities for each of you to share some expertise or some wisdom with the larger group. I could keep on going, but I think those are just a few ideas.
I would like to mention another one, and that is planners. The big need is for people who plan events. And cultural events are always good. International Day, where people from all these different cultures can bring food and whatever the situation may call for, bring this together and enjoy the richness of our neighborhood, of our family, of our Abrahamic family. And I think planners, even in our mosque, I always look for planners who can plan something and implement it. Because if we got good planners, people who plan events, then a lot can happen. And then sometimes we need the motives to work with the planners because
didn't affect the violations at all, percentage-wise. But I think you have to start with education. You have to be continually getting the word out, starting with it. But my question or my wonderment is always, how do you get those peripheral people, or the people who aren't going to listen or be part of the events that are planned and the programs? And I think that the family of Abraham would be a good group to do some focus groups. So some of those groups that maybe aren't as willing to step forward, asking them, what is it that keeps you from interacting with these other faith groups, or what are you afraid of, or, of course, creating a culture of safety so those conversations are good, but then, this as a launching place for how to get to those marginal groups within these three faith traditions who aren't going to be stepping forward naturally. That's one.
Okay, I'm just so you know, as the MC and the person watching the time, we are going to break for our reception right at 8:30, so we'll have 8 minutes left here for the last 4 questions that I have in hand. The next one is a fairly straightforward one, Dr. Tutt, Mr. Tutt, maybe just a clarification. You had said that ending bigotry is a political endeavor, but the person writing the note here points out that the ultimate solution to ending obstacles to a mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, was through the U.S. Department of Justice, and that was a political solution.
Right. I guess what I was trying to say was we need to be aware of our own mission. And our own mission is not a political mission, but even though it's not a political mission, we can make a huge impact on combating bigotry. Of course, sometimes, like the model I was saying of Dr. King's universal justice, it's a holistic model. It requires at all means possible, right? I mean, bigotry in that vision, I believe, is a secondary outcome of a large injustice taking place. Is Islamophobia a secondary outcome? I think that's a matter of debate. But I think ultimately, this kind of work, if you look at the Sharia law legislation that happened in 30 states last year, the year before, it was interfaith coalitions, almost 9 times out of 10, that stopped them from becoming enacted. Groups like Family and Imam, not necessarily political groups, because they knew the Muslims and they could speak for them. So it was a subtle point. Is that pretty adequate? You're throwing some fruit at us. Okay.
This question, I think, may have been answered with this. What are ways to get Muslims, Jews, and Christians and others together to really know each other, learn about each other's religions and values, and create long-time friends? I think we talked about some ways to create community. Is there anything else that you folks could think of?
Food is usually the most important.
Speaking of the reception, which is 5 minutes away. So this is Mr. Tutt. My concern is less about individual bigotry than about institutional and mass bigotry, in parentheses, especially via some churches. What do you suggest as a bridging technique here?
Yeah,
if bridging is the right.
Yeah, a great question. Often it starts, we have a benefit of being hierarchical organizations, and the benefit, I think, is that you can form a relationship with the leadership. And you start there, and it trickles down, one would hope. Because often there is a sort of battle of winning the hearts and minds of an influential pastor that may run a mega church, and I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. And what we have found that works well is introducing the right kind of people at a high level leadership level, and being very strategic about how to do that. For example, we started with behind-the-scenes relationship building with several pastors in Texas, evangelicals that had a slight interest in, maybe I'm interested in learning about Islam. So we started by introducing them to the right people. And then over time, they gradually began to do programs. But the first program they did, the community was not prepared to actually have Muslims inside the church. So we screened the film. And that had to do with Islamic things so they could learn. So we take it very gradually. And then in time, this one pastor, I won't name his name, ended up going on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and he prayed in the house. Go figure. So, not to say that he's less devout as a Christian for doing that, but the point is that interfaith is like a virus. When people get that virus, even people that you would never suspect to get that virus, and I've seen it happen. But once you get the virus, you can't get it. It's kind of addictive. It's a really great activity to do. And so you need to introduce it to them at that level, at the leadership level, I would say.
Unless there were other questions that came in, I think this is the last one. This was from a non-Muslim who points out that they're not defending or ignoring massive prejudice from non-Muslims against Muslims, but expresses a kind of an element of concern or fear. How can I, as a non-Muslim, recognize when a Muslim is truly open to legitimate alternatives rather than play acting? How can I, as a non-Muslim, recognize when a Muslim is truly open to legitimate alternatives rather than play acting?
I guess that's a problem everywhere, in whatever we do. But I think, religion is sincere. And I think trying to find somebody who's sincere. The idea of and I would love to do this, just invite me out of any church, any place. I would love to just be bombarded with questions about Islam. Even those terrible questions, they have these questions like the prophet was a pedophile, and Muslims mandated in the Quran to kill all the Christians. You can't kill Christians. Allah forbid. Christian, and then they said the Quran should kill the infidel. Who said a Christian were infidels? Christians are not infidels. They're believers. Believers are not infidels. So a lot of times we just need to hear things straight from the Muslim. And if we can, as much as possible, if you're not a member of this church or even this church or some other church, and you feel that your congregation needs to, I'll go, but they don't have to be intimidated. I'll be the only Muslim there. And just bombard me with whatever questions you have. Because I'm from a family of 15 brothers and sisters, or 14, I'm making 15. Every one of them Christian with me. And you think I don't love Christians? I love my family. When they started in Dallas, and you come up to, they came to Nashville, picked me up, and went to Boston to see my sister, and went over to Chicago to see my other sister, and then come back to Nashville. We drove, 1,100 miles without ever turning the radio on. I had such a good time. And in Basket, I know some Christian ministers in Nashville. I love those men, and they love me. And every time we see each other, we just love each other. If one of you be on the radio, they'll call the radio just to speak to their good friend. And I think that this can go a long way with all of us. But if this is not your church, if you have a church, you can get to your pastor and tell them, look, the Imam will come, and he'll sit, and you can bombard him all day. And he'll help us as much as we want to be helped. And I won't say anything but what